My goal is to live to be 140 and to do it well. Not just to live to 140, but to be able to walk, to be able to function. Where do people live to be 100? Well, you have the blue zones, and they have a certain mindset in order to achieve that result. Being mindful of what you eat and what you think, what you do. Like, I have good thoughts, I do good deeds, and I ascend. And right now, like I said, I'm on vacation. And so in order to do that,
welcome to the Brett Bennis Podcast, where I bring together a variety of experts in the field of helping you live a happier, healthier, and more fulfilling life. With us today is Dr. Patricia Boulogne. She is a consultant, an executive coach, wellness strategist, and a mindset mastery expert. She works to empower high-achieving professionals, athletes to optimize health, boost performance, and drive productivity without burnout. She's a veteran of 250-plus podcasts. She has 4 books out that either she authored or she was featured in, and she was featured in Your Success magazine. I really enjoyed this discussion. I think you will too. Let's go. Can you just share with the viewers a brief snippet about what it is that you do and what type of people you help in your professional sphere?
what I do is I help people elevate their lives through mastery and through intention. And how I do that is that I look at people like they're executives, they're high performers, they could be elite athletes. I worked with the LPGA at one point in time in the medical tent. So I've got to talk to them about their mindset and about how they focus and all these things that kind of added up to what I'm doing now. But I help people be on that particular part of their game and not, I'm a different kind of coach because I'm not interested in changing someone's whole entire life. It's just like what I'm interested in is like taking a look at what's working, what's not working, how can you tweak what's not working or eliminate it, and then elevate that, and then recalibrate exactly where you're at. Like when you're going to go do a purification program, you think like you get to a point where you're going, I got to do it. And then you order it, you sit down, you read the book, and then you implement it, and you start doing things. And some of it you go like, oh, I'm never going to eat broccoli. I said, I've got to have a different vegetable. This is in very simplistic form. And to be able to change that to something else. So I might like Brussels sprouts, or I might like cabbage. I might have another vegetable that I can supplement for that. And having the awareness to be able to like what makes that work, because in order to uplift and transform, you've got to have the basics in place. You have to have your foundation aligned, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, social, and even financial. So I help people do that, and I talk about like leaders and entrepreneurs. Every parent that I know, because I always think that they never get included, every parent that I know is a leader in some form. They have to do that every day. And they're a great salesperson because they have to do that every day, when they're talking to their kids, so I include that in that group also.
So it sounds like regardless of the type of person that you're working with, whether it be CEOs, parents, high-profile athletes, whatever it is, you take what they're already doing and you help them, sounds like, optimize it so that they can start, it sounds like, making the changes that they're wanting to make but somehow can't make. You help them make that. You help them bridge that gap.
Well, sometimes they don't have the awareness, that there's a gap, and so when someone tells me their story, and how they got to where they got to, and, and then, some of the times it's just like there's spaces that seem to be left out. So, you just ask, and then you ask them questions about that, because even in my early years when I was working with athletes and started working with executives, and I worked with executives. I had a practice on Cape Cod for 10 years. Most of the people I saw between 8 and 9 o'clock were people who were catching the bus. So I learned how not to talk a lot and just say, tell me what's going on today, lay on the table. We're going to continue working with what we have. And then I might ask a couple questions, and I got them out the door so they could jump in their cars. They could go and catch the bus so they could go to Boston, which was an hour bus ride. So, and then elite athletes were a lot of the same way. I realized there really isn't, when that high performance piece, there's like, they're very similar because they have similar goals. about winning and about in their own body's ability to sustain over a period of time. So I
hmm
have a method that I call like the 360 life mastery like method and mindset where you're looking at like the whole piece. You don't take just a portion of it because what you're doing or believing about your weekend might be affecting what you do on a Wednesday board meeting. Or might be affecting your performance when you're trying to go get ready to perform in either like, for windsurfing or for volleyball or for playing golf. It's just like I swear I can take almost anybody, and I would say 100% because I'm sure there's what one person out there, but I've improved almost every person's golf game that I ever worked with.
Really?
And part of it is, you got to have the mindset component of it so that you can deal with the exercise and the nutrition and how much sleep because you have to have that strong, robust mind, and sometimes we think we have it and then something will blow us out of the water, whatever it is, like your mother calls you in the middle part of the day or something, like that, or, you see something that you're emotionally struck by, and
hmm
that's the last thing in the world that you ever expected that. But I see and have witnessed burnout on so many levels. I've experienced it myself more than once. And so, and all those things, when I kept on going for that higher education portion of it, and I always said my father rolls over in his grave every time I get another degree. That part of it, is just like, and looking at strategic performance and looking at how you're functioning in your body, like mind, body, and soul, on that physical, mental, emotional, spiritual level, in order to elevate, you got to have those pieces there. And when you find the weak link, then you can go about like, you don't want to fix a weak link to find out you have another one. So you really need to take
hmm
in the whole person in one lump sum. That's where the 360 comes in.
And that was one of the things that I got really excited about in preparation to talk to you as I was reading a little bit about your background, because it's something that's so important that my wife and I call it a generalist, someone who
Mhm,
is able to take disparate fields, disparate specializations, and integrate them in a way that is holistically relevant and
mhm,
beneficial. And it's such a rare skill I feel like in our culture, we have valued specialists above everything. And we look for, maybe it's the industrialized culture, but we look for, where do you fit in the wheel, like the cog? Let's plug you in, and we need this one skill from you. And in that, we lose a sense of the importance of someone who can bring everything together. It's a
mhm.
little bit more of I think a little bit more of a CEO mindset than a worker mindset. But I love that you're bringing that mindset to wellness and to essentially optimizing someone's life so that they can accomplish what they're doing. And you mentioned earlier, whether someone's doing golf or raising kids, it doesn't matter really where they apply these skills. You are optimizing their machine in a way. You're optimizing their life so that they can actually accomplish the things that they're doing. Where did that come from? Is this something that you grew up with? Or is it something that like you hit a wall and then all of a sudden you had to learn it yourself?
I think I came out of the chute like that. One of the things, like when you were talking about this, is that when I took, what do they call those? Like those tests that tell you what you're going to do when you grow up. What's the best way for you to go? And my highest score was in being a general practitioner. And then the second one was an orthopedic surgeon. And I didn't like knives, and I hated blood. So those were not the choice. So I went into did chiropractic, and I looked in for alternative ways to achieve the same result without the trauma involved, generally speaking. And one of the things is that you mentioned that I have a gift for is being able to synthesize numerous things into, convoluted things and make them simple. You know, with a safer solution that's quick, and I do that across different sectors, not just health and wellness. I do it in, I've worked in startups in R&D, and I've worked in other startups. Right now I have something on the table that I'm working, have an interest in, that's a startup, and I try to avoid startups unless they're actually paying me. But I have an interest in this just because think that there's a huge amount of potential for what they're trying to do. So I'm keeping my finger in the ink pot. But the awareness is the biggest thing that people, that if you can get someone more aware, then they're more likely to comply with what you want to have, what you want them to do. So one of the people who I worked with, that was a patient of mine, and for years, she said, "Does anyone ever say no to you?" And I said, "Not really." But I also, it's just like when I'm telling somebody, I don't tell someone to do something, especially in their health, unless I've done it myself. And unless I've done enough research in it, I can confidently say, it's just like I've never did this, but this is what this purported to do. And I've read too many studies that are positive on it as opposed to negative, so I always preface my conversations like that. And if I've done it, then I'll say, this is what, I did. This is what you can expect. And I talk from that point of view, because I always think when people want to reach their greatest goals, they don't want to wait like 20 years. And if you can, maximize and minimize that time span and still reach the same goals without, like taking away from your career or your relationships or your health or your mind, because nobody wants to lose their mind. It's just like then you have that opportunity to be able to reach those goals in less time, and that they're safer, quicker, and with simpler solutions.
Wow. And so you started off in chiropractic and then you just started branching out? Where did you go to after that? What was kind of your journey to get to where you're basically coaching people on everything, everywhere, all the time? Like it's
Right,
business or
right.
parenting
Well,
or sports. Like how did
right.
you get there?
Well, I had years of experience, number one. Number two, I had incredible mentors in my industry. So I was just talking about this today to in a previous conversation with a osteopath. And what I said to him was, when I was in school, I was taught, this is like, I'm old, in a way. I'm an elder. I always think I don't want to be old. I want to be an elder because elders have wisdom. People who, if you're old, you don't necessarily have wisdom. So I'm an elder. I used to say my dog was an elder, and because he was the meditation dog, just ready to go. But
They have
the
wisdom and purpose for something like moving a people group, moving a
bigger because,
community.
well,
Yeah.
I can see when everyone else is on G in the alphabet, I'm on Z, and I'm moving on to my next thing. I can synthesize things very quickly. And I have street sense enough to know when they get the heck out of Dodge, in that. So being the wisdom part of that comes in from repetitious behavior. So I always say that I have had the blessing of being taught the um, the lessons in my industry as a chiropractor by the people who created them, not by the guy who was his best follower or something like that. I've always had the guy who invented the technique, the and then like when you're doing, the first when people started doing like mindset work. I mean, I can remember seeing Tony Robbins. I never paid to see Tony Robbins, but Tony Robbins taught me how to bend a spoon. And he came into my chiropractic group when he was seriously nobody, and he was a friend of the guy who was the head of our management group. And then what I learned from my management group is like how to take what they taught me, and I kept on applying it to other things. So when I bought my practice initially and it was underserved, when I sold it, I had a big practice. When I got divorced, I had a big practice, and I bought my ex-husband out of that practice. And because he wanted to move someplace, I felt really connected to being where I was at. So we just decided to go different paths at that point in time. Um, and then I had the opportunities, like, and I never said no. And someone said, "Hey, do you want to go to China and study at the Olympic Training Center?" I didn't ask how much it costs. I said, "Sure, when we going? How many people do you need?" And, because I'm thinking, I know so many people, like, would you want to do this? It was like $2,500 for a 3-week program, including airfare. And so, except for that, I had to get out to California in order to do that, but that's the only part that I paid extra. And And so we had all these like really great educational exchanges with people who a friend of mine is an orthopedic guy in his office. He has the same pictures I had in my office of being in China with the same people. And they, like 15 years apart, and they looked exactly the same as they did 15 years before that. So I brought my pictures in one time and we were comparing them. I said, they never age. What do you think their secret is? It's like, oh, because that was, you know, it was just one of those like those things that happen. So anytime somebody gave me an opportunity to go and study, I one time someone said, you should come to Venice for this conference. Who's going to be there? It was an AK, Applied Kinesiology Conference. Who's going to be there? And so they're telling me two people I knew out of the 20 people they're going, like it's a whole Italian, it'll give you a good networking connection. And so, but who was there though, that was crucial to something I did later on was this guy, Pierre Mersman, who was a chiropractor who was married to a dentist. And his work in TMJ matched Mehta, a doctor named Mehta at Tufts University in the United States. Actually, when I met Dr. Mehta, like 5 years later, said, when I said, oh, I studied underneath, Mersman when I was in Italy, blah, blah, blah. And he's going, oh my God, I just talked to him last week. It was like those coincidences happen to me all the time in my life, and then I like learning and then taking that to the next level, and it's really fascinating. I recently went to a mold conference, and this guy talked about how mold was like living rigor mortis, and that people's aches and pains sometimes in them are so significant that, the growth of mold, and everyone has it. No one talks about it, but everyone has it. According to his statistics, he was an ex-anesthesiologist who went and ventured this way to help people. And I started testing people in where I'm up here at the Finger Lakes, and every person that is like major dizzy, up here, but there's a lot of mold and mildew in people's houses up here. And so I'm going like, it was just one of those like a wow moment again. I'm going, think about how many people are up here that I can help, and it's like, and share that information. It's a little way out there kind of information, but if it works, who cares? You're spending $30 as opposed to thousands of dollars, on medicine that's not helping you, it's making you worse. So, and then also, synthesizing, that piece, and it applies to so many things, and looking at like, where's the end of the road, it's just like, well, I see if we go turn right here, we can get there faster. I'm going to arrive sound, and then I can circle back this way and come up here and get you guys and bring you down. So I'm always thinking, I never say no to a good invite.
It's
I
awesome. It
just
sounds
figure it
like
out.
the perfect blend of opportunity, but also mindset, taking advantage and
Mhm.
just knowing that things will work out as you go. Much of what you've described in your work sounds like you do a lot of kind of personal one-on-one work with people, working with as a coach and that sort of thing. But the experience that you have and the network that you've been building over the years, do you find yourself working as like a coordinator between different types? Hey, you also need someone who specializes in X, Y, and Z. I have a friend. Let me introduce you. Do you do
Right.
that as well in
I do
your?
that for sure. It's just like people, I'm a connector. And someone goes, do you know anybody? I mean, someone called me up the other day and asked me for an email of somebody who doesn't have a published email who's in the politics. And so I said, I don't know. You're the first, they said to me, you're the first person, Pat, I thought of, and then I thought about it, and I said back, I said, I'll check in with a girlfriend of mine who knows more people than God, who has a lot of political connections, and see if she comes up with your answer, or not. We don't have the answer yet, but because that just happened the other day, but I like to connect people with the right people. It's just like, nobody wants to go to the wrong doctor. And because if you do, it wastes your time, your energy, and your life, and so it's just like if you get with the right doctor, and if and I'm always thinking outside the box. So it's just like you give me something, I'm not in the box because in the box is only what you knew. It's only what you know that you've been taught. It doesn't mean that's the right answer, so I'm going like, well, what else would work? I mean, if you're somebody, call me up. I need to know what I can eat. I hate this food and it's in this program, I'm going like, well, what's the program for? number one, and you define it and then it's going, okay, so why don't you like, eliminate that and then, add this in and see if you have the same response. If you don't have a good response with it, then you're going to have to like, we're talking 21 days or 28 or 60 days. We're not talking for the rest of your life. And in supplements and even medications, like some medications are poison for one person, the next person they're a godsend. And so in the supplementation, it's the same thing. I don't always take the same supplementation. It's just like I'll get to a point where I will change, like if depend upon it depends upon what my immediate goals are, you know, what I'm doing, which path I go in, and then I will research that out. And then for me, somebody says, "Oh, you get a lot of stuff from Amazon." I said, "I do, but it's all related to my health." Occasionally I'll buy a pair of shoes or something like that, but most of it is, I'm looking for a specific supplementation, and I only order it that way because I get it directly to my door, and sometimes I get it faster and it's cheaper, than if I went through my usual professional pro bono type things and that. But, people send me stuff all the time, like, "What do you think about this?" And I've worked on R&D for a startup for skincare and hair care, and, I really, one of my things I always tell people, you've got to read ingredients. And if you don't understand them, who cares if you can't pronounce them? If you don't understand them, you better understand what the side effects are of them, and because
Hmm.
or can these things be used in, congruency? Can you put them in the same ingredient? And that's something to really always be mindful of, where that's coming from.
You mentioned something that really hit me with the point is what works. And it reminded me I've practiced multiple different martial arts over the years. And inevitably, no matter what type of martial art, no matter what the origin is, whether it's European or Eastern or whatever, you run into people who are at a certain level in the martial art and they are die hard for that one martial art. This is
Hmm.
the best one. It's better than all the other ones. All the other ones are crap, all of that. And then you meet other people who are in that same discipline who are much further along in their practice.
Hmm.
And there's a shared mindset that I've seen that is indicative of someone who's reached a certain level. It's that I kind of view it as there are silos between these different arts up to a point, and then the silos
Hmm.
disappear and it just becomes what works. And I've seen that in different martial arts because at the end of the day, it's all body mechanics. It's all manipulation and all of that, no matter what art you're doing. And people have different approaches, but once you reach a certain level, it's all how well do you know and how well can you manipulate body mechanics. And it sounds like you've reached a similar point with understanding these different disciplines and understanding whether it be physical health or mental health or all these different things. How do you That's something that's really missing, but I feel like it's coming next. It's coming next for health and wellness, for the culture in the West. How do we make that shift from very kind of black and white thinking, my way or the highway, everyone else is in a different discipline. They don't know what they're talking about. It's hocus pocus or whatever. How do we help the culture make that shift to it's different disciplines all looking at the same thing? How can we work together?
Well, one of the best ways to defray an argument is to agree with the person. And so if you're, and, because a lot of times people have that, when they're on their game and it's like around here in the Finger Lakes, Western medicine. I'm used to living in Boston where they had the best hospitals in the world, some of the best hospitals in the world, not just there, there's other locations too. But breaking out in my practice from, everyone hated chiropractors. I would just go up to them, would go talk at the Rotary, and I'd ask whoever invited me, introduce me to 3 medical doctors. I don't care what their specialty is, I just wanna meet them, and then because I wasn't talking, I was just there, and other types of those kinda meetings. And so, and then one day I just called up somebody in Boston who, at Carnegie Hospital, which is not one of the big 3, but, I talked to this guy who was an orthopedic, and what he said made total sense to me, and I agreed with him, and he said, And I said, I'd like to send you patients for second opinions because there's nobody on Cape Cod that I trust their second opinion. And I want someone who doesn't care about the outcome. They care about the person who's being seen. And he goes, you're refreshing, and then I made other connections in Boston, OBGYN, and I've saved, there's women that in my office that were misdiagnosed, and they had cancer, and they were misdiagnosed from, mainstream big name, labs in Boston, and I said, "You've got something wrong with you." And they go, "How do you know that?" And I said, "You've got something wrong with you." I said, "Go see this OBGYN and have her pull your records," because I didn't have access to ER records at that time, and so, and then I would call up the office manager. If you ever want something in an office, always talk to the office manager. They have the trump card in order to go from point A to point Z. And so I sent this one woman up there that I recall so vividly, and she just said, and she had cancer that was spreading from her vagina to her bladder to her rectum, and they missed it, and it was already in stage 2. It was already going through the wall. And I'm going thinking, and she goes, "I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for you." And I said, "Well, I'm just glad that you found it. Let's just fix the problem." And I said, "You got a problem, fix it. What's the solution?" Because sometimes you have to like make those educated decisions about how to move forward. So when I meet somebody who's so stuck in their thought processes, they're just not evolved people, and you want to be around like-minded people. So you have to really minimize what you say because, and also, choose your words very wisely, but make sure that when you leave them that they have a win in their back pocket, and you can agree to disagree, and make it into a positive experience. But that's what,
So it sounds like
how I overcame that is by, walking up and saying, "Hi, my name is Pat Boulogne, and I'm a chiropractor on Cape Cod," at the time. And, or when I talked to the Lions Club, it's anytime I had an opportunity, I just told somebody who I was, where I was at. And if you'd like me to take a look at you, I'd be more than happy to take a look at you. And if I can help you, I will tell you. If I can't, if I can, I will tell you exactly. And when I can't, I'll tell you who I think you should go see, and I'll give you a couple options with that. Because I might not be your answer, but I don't want you to waste your time, your energy, or your life in the wrong place.
it sounds like you're saying that the way that you overcome that, or the way that you overcame that, is primarily through people, through networking and finding people with whom to ally yourself and
Mhm,
to and there's two parts of it. One is finding the right people who already have a mindset that's conducive to cooperation. But then there's the other side of it that you mentioned, but you didn't go too deep into, is using personal connection to break down barriers,
mhm,
where people are much more quick to dismiss random so and so over there that they've never met, their practice, their work, all of that, versus, yeah, I have a personal connection with someone. I've met them, I know them, they seem like good people. Maybe what they do isn't so bad. And
mhm.
you start breaking down barriers in psychology in that way. You see that in politics, you see that all over the place. It's really hard to vilify, to use that end of a term. It's really hard to vilify someone with whom you've shaken hands and shared coffee. And it's so those two different things, finding the right people, but also cultivating the right people in a way.
Right.
Would you agree with how that?
Absolutely. I mean, whether it's in politics or whether it's in any industry, you try to find common ground, but if you can't find common ground, just agree with them. It's just like it totally takes them off guard. And then, you ask them something, it's just like anytime that somebody has said no to me on LinkedIn, for whatever reason, I'll go and look at their profile, and I usually find something in their profile that relates to that I'm from the Midwest, and or I'll ask them a question specifically about something in their profile that's relevant to what I asked them originally. And it's just like, like, "Hey, you're a big, hotshot attorney, and you are in an industry that when I studied for the law boards, I had an interest in going into, but I ended up getting divorced and taking over a practice instead." I said, "So tell me how that's working out for you." And it's a total different tone
We'll get back to that conversation in just a minute. If you've been enjoying this podcast, you might be interested in some other resources we've been developing. Search benniscompanies.com and you will find books, podcasts, and other resources to help you live a happier, healthier, and more fulfilling life. Let's go.
It's just like, I'm not trying to sell you something. You can't sell health to anybody. That's a mistake that people make. You can't sell health. You can't buy health. You can buy, the things that help support you have better health, but you better work with somebody who knows how to utilize them and put them in the right order so that you get the best benefits out of it and you have an outcome that you're looking for and actually being able to achieve.
So some people, I think, who might be watching their reaction, I think, might be to say that's disingenuous or that's just, but I feel like what you're doing is more of a heart first approach where
Hmm.
you are connecting with someone. And if you can touch someone's heart, you can work with their head. But if someone's heart is already against you, their head is never going to open up, and it's worthless to try to just convince their head if you're not connected with their heart. It sounds like that's more of what you're trying to do. Is that accurate?
That's accurate even with patients who, in coming into a different practice, you have different personalities, doctors, and you have different personalities of patients that are there. Some of them you're never going to connect with, and what I learned after 38 years of being in this profession is that the people who you don't connect with, you find them, the kiss instead of the dagger is that you find them somebody who they can connect with. Because some people, there's nothing that you ever could do that's ever gonna make anything right for them, and they don't wanna find that. It's a lot of it is all up here in their head, but, it's just like, there is something just like, like, "How can I help you?" It's just like, I won't have an argument with somebody like that. It's like, How can I help you? What can I do for you today?" And what's going on? And then, if I had a girl who freaked out about her when she's getting something out of her pocket. This is up here about maybe like 8 months ago, and then this coin dropped on the floor, and I said, "Aren't you gonna pick it up?" And she said, "Well, no." And I said, "Why is that?" He goes, "People put things on coins, that harm them for the people who are picking them up." And I said, "But that coin was already in your pocket." "Yes, but we don't know what's on the floor." And I said, "Are you listening to yourself talk? Who said that to you anyway?" And I was so curious. I'm going, "Where did you get that belief system?" It totally blew me away. And so she said, "Well, my mother always said that." And I said, "Has your mother been right all the time?" "I'm sure mothers are always right." I said, "But is she right all the time?" "No, do you think she might be wrong about that?" And I said, "Look, I'll pick it up, but if I pick it up, I'm keeping it." And so she just looked at me and started laughing. And I picked it up and I said, "Do you know what year this is on this coin here?" And it was like once something you don't see. I said, "Oh my God, it's a wheat penny. Do you know how much these are worth?" I said, "Here's your penny back." I said, "This is a time that a penny saved is not a waste of time." And I said, "Wheat pennies have value. You should take this to somebody who can value this for you." And I said, "But I need you to touch it. You can go wash your hands if you want." And I said, "But this is your penny. If you want to own it, then you got to touch it." And she said, "Okay." And she just grabbed it and she grabbed it and we both kind of laughed. And I said, "Is your mother still alive?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Bring her in here. I'd like to treat her." And I said, "Your mom," I said, I go, we get some of those thought processes from our childhood, and we don't know why we say them or why we do them, but we carry them through our lives. And many of those things hinder us mentally from moving forward, in whatever direction that you want to go. So that it takes, and then those things you keep on hitting, like, why is it that every time I get so successful, I think about, blah, blah, blah. And then you keep on hitting the wall. It's just like, I
Hmm.
wanna take those thought processes and the trauma work that I do and it isn't like they didn't happen, but having the charge off of them gives you freedom, and you should have freedom in your life to
Hmm.
think, feel, move, and do it a lot better than what you're doing.
And you talk about mastery in some of your profiles and some of your works. And it seems like that is where you begin to attain a certain level of mastery is when you can decide, I have this thing that's inside of me but I'm going to decide whether to listen to it or not.
Mhm.
And then you start to elevate beyond the things that are driving you, and you begin to take control of them. And it sounded like with the person that you mentioned, they had something either at the level of the subconscious or even the spiritual, I don't know, but there was something that they believed. And then you mentioned that they kind of came up with a couple different reasons why they shouldn't do this thing.
Mhm.
And for me, that's usually an indication that they don't really know why. There's just something driving them, and they're like coming up with reasons why they shouldn't do this thing or why they should do this thing. But what you help people do is you kind of uncover that and lift that up and like, is this actually something you want to keep or is it not? And begin to develop self-mastery with that.
Well, part of the thing too is like, I work with people and I teach the concept of the three brains, because you have a lizard brain, which is your primitive brain, which is your, like, your basic needs to protect you for fright, flight, for eating food, and to slam your foot on the brakes when a car pulls in front of you, the saber-toothed tiger. Then you have your mammalian brain that listens to the primitive brain. That's the one that says you can't do this, or you like, don't pick that penny up, blah, blah, blah. And the primitive brain works, on that automation because it's trying to protect you, and also in the mammalian brain, it stores everything that's ever happened to you in that brain. So it draws upon, like, like we talked about etiquette before we were getting on, the show, right? It's just like, where did I get my, acronym for, the etiquette for podcasts? It's just, I've been on a lot of them. I had no clue as to what I told you in the beginning, but now I have a better clue in how to make it much more, enjoyable, but also deliver a lot of value. So, in that mammalian brain is also the holy grail of marketing because there's a pain point and the primitive brain's going, yep, that's it again. Guys with red hair, they're all the same, or, like when I eat, or drink milk, I need to have it, with lactose free because it doesn't bother my stomach. But I also had that experience with, raw milk, and I didn't have that experience, that bad experience. So it created a positive experience with milk using the raw milk, which may be because it's ultra pasteurized and ultra homogenized. On the lactose free one, or even on regular milk, there might be some harmful elements in it that if you're going to drink milk, and if you drink milk that is on, that has value to it, it can help your health to evaluate your health and elevate you. So then you have the conscious brain, and the conscious brain is the one we're talking with right now. It's the rational brain. It wants to put things in right side, left side. And so when something comes up, and I always say the guy on this shoulder here, and so when it's like comes up and you're going like, oh no, I don't know. Might not do it. I should do it. Like, and you're hemming and hawing and the mammalian's brain's going, yes, but you had a good experience with that. You had two good experiences and only one bad experience. I mean, it remembers everything, and then you're thinking, why, I don't think I'm the right person for that, and maybe you are, and maybe you're not. But if you don't take a look at how your brains communicate with each other, you have to quill. If you can control the conversation that you have with the primitive brain, it can never control your life, and the mammalian brain, if you keep on feeding the mammalian brain your positive experiences, that's why people say affirmations like, I am healthy, vital, active, successful human being. I say that every day before I walk into my office, when I'm going to deal with people, when I get on a telephone call with somebody who's a client, because I want them to elevate. And I can't elevate them if I'm not elevated myself, And so in that conscious part of it, what all happens that when you say those things, then it goes to the back to the mammalian brain. The mammalian's going like, well, why is it that, I like to be healthy? And it starts answering those things. So when you acknowledge that, I like to be healthy because I can play with my grandkids. I can run as fast as my 5-year-old. And things like, and the people that you meet and the actions that, that you do together. So all those positive things can happen. So it's just like, those people who always find that darn parking spot directly out in front. You know, how do they do it? Think they consciously say that they need it. The mammalian brain figures that that's a good thing, and the primitive brain's going like, but you're going, I'm not listening to you. Excuse me. I'm listening to my conscious brain because I'm going to create a positive experience for that.
So I have a question. It's a little bit of a personal question for me on that. I I have a personal definition that I have for anxiety, and I kind of think of that as being at war with myself, where I'm not committed to a specific direction. I'm not bought in, and I'm constantly asking myself and questioning myself and going back and forth. And part of that, I think, is that I recently discovered that I have ASD, autism
Mm,
spectrum disorder.
mhm,
And one of the core experiences that I think people with ASD and like things experience in their upbringing is that they internalize a belief from constantly getting this feedback that I'm doing it wrong. I'm doing
mhm.
it wrong. I'm doing it wrong. People are constantly giving that feedback to someone with ASD and probably similar types of brains. And you internalize the belief of there's some right way out there, and I I don't intuitively know what it is. Everyone else seems to know what it is, but I don't. And you're questioning everything, and it's really difficult to. We mentioned earlier how parents, part of their role is to become leaders, and that's something that I've been experiencing a lot, where I'm having to learn how to overcome these tendencies that I've developed from having ASD and growing up and the trauma related to that. And being a parent has really forced me into that because there's no one to whom I can pass the buck. I have to make the decision. And I've had to overcome a lot of that, but at being at war with myself and learning, what's your advice on how do you find that kind of central line of this is who I am and this is what I'm going to do, or at least how I'm going to navigate life. Like you mentioned, getting the self-mastery, but also navigating when those different parts of your brain are fighting in a way and are working, and you need to get them on the same boat, working towards the same direction. How does someone begin that journey? How does someone begin to do that in their life?
Well, you tell the lizard brain to shut up and in no certain terms. It's just, like, because it's valuable for when you're in imminent danger, or when, like you need to stop eating, or when you need to eat and when you need to fornicate, and things like that. But it's not useful when you're doing the rest of your life. And so when I tell people that, I said, when I can remember one time that I thought that if I walked on this one trail that I was going to roll over and fall, or when I was going down the steps, I was going to fall, and what I realized is that every time that I said that, I tripped, and every time I said to myself, no, stop, stop, and I would take a big breath and I would just move forward. But I learned that at a very young age. And I always thought that rules were meant to be broken. So, good rules. And that some of them were there for a good reason. But having that ability and helping someone change those conversations that they have with themselves is very uplifting because when you start having it where I'm not a bad person. I was just told I was bad or I was stupid. I had a client from the University of Glasgow was one of I said, God, if you want me to coach, you better give me somebody because I don't know. I said, I need some help here, and the next day this guy reached out and said, I want to work with you. I'm a student at the University of Glasgow. And when I first talked to him, his advisor told him he was basically an idiot. And I said, he said, yeah, he goes, I'm in England. We don't say those words. But, and he said that, I said, you're a slow learner. I said, if you've studied Western medicine, if you read some of the books, you'd read the same paragraph over 5 times before you got it. And I said, there's nothing wrong with reading the paragraph over again, and so because he showed me his testing that he did, I was mortified. I said, don't ever listen to that guy again. Never. When he says something to you, just put a shield up. and pushes energy back at them. You can do it simply with talking with your hands. I come from a French Italian family, so this it's easy. But I just like you don't listen to it. You just like you can listen to it from afar, but you don't take it on as a value or truth unless you had personal experience with it. It's like my mother was, oh, I hope you find your niche. And I got used to like not listening to people who had an opinion about what I was doing or not doing. You know, their opinion was more harmful than me just going and doing it. And when I had that realization, I stopped having those reactions. I would just say, thanks for sharing that with me. And and then I'd push my hands to see you later. Yeah, and but it worked because those physical things that we do, we create our barrier. Some person who was really into meditation one time, and I was going through a tough time when I was in acupuncture school, and he told me to, and he actually worked for me for about 8 years, and I was still in Massachusetts, so I was in school in Florida, and he was telling me about calling white light and putting it down to my feet, and then spiraling it back up and doing it as many times until I felt comfortable. And then what I did that he didn't tell me to do is I decided to push out the energy of those corners and create a pyramid, because pyramids are very strong, even energetic ones. And so I would do that, and then I would push it up, and then I'd put Wayne Dyer always said, like, when you're meditating, put a trolley strap over you, so in case you need it, you got it to grab, and it's always there. It gives you peace of mind. Peace of mind is priceless. And so I used to do this, and when I first started practicing it, my walls were only like arm's length. I'm 6 feet, so I had 6 feet, 6 feet. And then one day did it and I just said, I want this to go farther. How far can I push? And I pushed it. And I'm going like, wow, Africa. Because I was down in Florida. So I go, Africa, and then the other side was Washington State. And then I just imagined where the base of that was, because your mind's so powerful. If you can see it, you can have it. And so if you see that, then you're inside that and you only let people in that resonate with you. And if somebody has something that's negative, then you start saying, love you, have a great day. And you just push, it's just like, thanks for, I learned how to say, thanks for sharing that with me. And or I understand, and it's just like, it diffuses those conversations and elevates them and it protects you also. So I think we have to have better tools to protect ourselves, in that, so that when you're, when you're asking that, when I have a lady that I'm working with right now, she's been on antidepressant drugs over 40, the same one. I just went, wow, do you have a therapist? And, because I'm up someplace where there's not a lot of alternative health up here is not really considered. It's considered, but it's not considered by Western medicine as something special. And so I just asked her, I said, we should talk sometime. We can't talk in the 15-minute slot here, but because I need to reserve longer time for you. But there's testing I can do on you that I know how I can take a charge off of something that you bury deep inside your body. And then we can get rid of that charge. So it existed, but it doesn't control your life anymore. Does that sound good to you? And she is so like, where did you learn that? And she was like, and I said, and I believe that no encounter is by chance. Everything's prescribed, as it has a reason. Somebody needs to hear something that I'm talking about today to change their life, or to uplift their life. Like, I can add water, and that will help my brain. Absolutely, but you have to add good water. But the, but doing it that way, I think that, and kids that I used to do that had, autistic when I had my practice. I couldn't do it when I had when I was actually actively treating patients, but like one Saturday a month, I would see autistic girls or autistic kids without their parents, because their parents were triggers on a lot of them, and so I could get them so that they were a lot calmer, and not as reactive, not so fidget, like getting on a table and having them like lay still. It was, an absolute feat, and when the day that I asked this one parent to like, go leave the door open, but step outside, and she just said, "Well, I've always been with her." I said, "Maybe that's part of the problem. Let's see what she does when you're not here. You can have a seat right outside the door so you know that you're comfortable with what we're doing here." All I'm doing, and all I did is cranial sacral therapy on them. And it's just like there are things called still points that help calm the body. And this girl always slept really well. She didn't, like, when I used to see her, I'm going like, what happened yesterday? And I just ended up stopping because was going to sell my practice and stuff like that. And I moved to Boston, but it was a special time because I really got to see how people's, thought processes really dictate how their outcomes are. And if they can control that thought process from the primitive brain, and then, quell that, and then have the conscious brain speak to the mammalian brain, you can make strides in that. It's not going to happen overnight sometimes, but it's not going to necessarily happen overnight. But I love to see the light go on, in someone's face, and they're going like, wow, I can do that. And I said, you can. Let's try it,
That's
and see
awesome.
where we're
Thank you
at.
so much. Thank you for going through that. I have one kind of last question area for you, and that is you look back at your journey, you see everywhere you've been, everywhere you've been through, everything that you've done, and then you look ahead at what it is potentially on the horizon for you. Where do you think you are in the novel that is your story? What chapter do you think you're in, and where do you think this book is going? Where would you
Well,
want it to go?
somebody asked me last week, and actually more than one person at the same week, I get the same question, so I have to pay attention to the questions. They said, with your level of accolades, what the heck are you doing in Ithaca, New York? I said, well, first off, nobody in Ithaca, New York practices what I practice, number one. Number two, and I just looked at her, I said, I'm on vacation. And she said, didn't know how to answer to that one. And so, and I use it, again, because like when I go away and I'm trying to decompress, I'll go tell someone I'm on vacation, and I'm focusing. So the next part of it is the, going into the phase two, when you're writing the sequel. And because I think that people don't speak out, people are too complacent. And people don't speak out and don't speak out with their minds with the intention of being mindful of how they're speaking out. So I think that one of the things that for me, I don't know where it's going to take me, but I know I'm in the right place at the right time right now on vacation. Pretty soon I'm going to have to make a decision if how long I'm going to be on vacation. It might be 10 years, it could be 5, but I doubt it's going to be 5 or even 10 years. But I know my next step is to do something even bigger. So that's getting back on stage. You know, I'm upping my coaching and mentoring program, with high performers in 2026. I've been working on it all of 2025. And I'm the type A personality, though. Can't we do this in 3 weeks? And, in my office, it's like, we can implement this, and I just learned there's no process that does not require time. So, I'm going into my like third book, of Who Does That Anyway, for instance. Decided that would be a great title for a book because when you have high performance, if I know that drinking, 50% of my body weight in water is something that's really good for me, it's just like, what's stopping me from doing that? Technique, right? It's just like, do I need to know about water? You need to know about the quality of the water, but you don't need water. Your body, every cell and organ and tissue in your body needs it. Your brain needs it to detox, So, and a lot of things I see from people is because they're so dehydrated and they
So
eat crappy food.
you mentioned a couple different things. Essentially going bigger, writing the sequel, getting the next, you want to take your impact, sounds like, to the next level. And earlier you mentioned how you feel like you're an elder. And we talked about what that means, where you are caring for, orchestrating a community, bringing people together, that sort of thing. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the book Fathered by God by John Eldredge. He's the same person who wrote Wild at Heart, if you're familiar.
That one I heard.
And this book, essentially, is it's focused on the developmental journey of men, but I think the stages are really relevant where he talks about the first few stages of beloved son and then cowboy and then warrior and then king, and then that king transitions to become an elder or a sage. And
Mhm.
he talks about how when you're a king, you're running your own show. You are kind of the main person. You are owning the business, owning the practice, building, running, that sort of thing. And most people in America, most people in the West all the focus on being at that stage, at the king stage. And once you move beyond the king stage, people feel like they've been relegated. And he's like, no, there's something beyond that that's even bigger, and it's becoming a sage, becoming an elder, essentially, where you begin to minister to kings or queens, and you begin to essentially coordinate and bring them together using the experience and using the connections that you've developed. I'm wondering if there's anything for that, anything in that for you, and what does it mean to leverage all of that huge network that you've developed that we talked about, the people that you know, and like, what does it mean to bring those together and to create something that you're shepherding that's way bigger than yourself?
Well, one thing to know is that my goal is to live to be 140. And so I'm really still, like, at 71, I'm a child still. And so I'm only halfway through my life. And I always go by my intuitive age. I don't go by my chronological age. So when somebody asks me how old I am, I'm 43. And no matter what year my birthday turns, and I put numbers in that, like, how do I feel? Because I ask myself three basic questions, chronological age of my blood vessels. And that for people is a very hard thing to answer because they want to go into left brain mode because they want the textbook figure that one out. And you can't do it. This is all your intuition and about your energy levels and things like this. And the last thing is like your age of maturity. And so some people go like, "Oh," like as if they want to be the age of 60 or something like that, and I never subscribed to it. And so my age, no matter what year for the last 10 years, has always come up at 43, and I like 39 because it's divided by three. I mean, it has like, three. It's just like you can use those numbers a lot easier, but it's not always the case. But I just did it when you were talking and asking me that question. So my goal is to live to be 140 and to do it well, not just to live to 140, but to be able to walk, to be able to function, and I don't think, it's like, where do people live to be 100? Well, you have the blue zones, right? And they have a certain mindset, in order to achieve that result. And so being mindful of like what you eat and what you think, and what you do. Like I do good thought, like I have good thoughts, I do good deeds, and I ascend, and right now, like I said, I'm on vacation. And so when I get past this in order to do that and the elder wisdom, because I'm not a young soul, I'm an old soul, and I've always felt like an old soul. And I could see through things that when people would tell me stuff, I could read the in between the line stuff. And I said, so what you're really saying is this. Um, they're going, you should be an attorney, and I've heard that a lot too, but I feel like, when there's always something that you can do for your health, mind, body, and soul, mental, physical, spiritual, social, which also affects your financial bottom line also. So when you take that into account, and it isn't like, I spend Monday and I spend on physical, it's like it's infiltrated with everything that you do within your whole spectrum, and it's just like, where do I want to go? And then I say like, I want, wherever that is, I work the trip backwards. I don't start at the beginning. It's too taxing to do that. If I want to go to simplicity wise, if I want to go to Rome, I will look at what time planes arrive in Rome. And then I think, oh, I went, I don't want to be there and be jet lagged. So I want to leave as late as possible from the East Coast in order to get there so I'm not jet lagged. So you just like you take in other considerations and because it's all part of the pie and we're all going in the same direction. So we could do a lot better, at helping people out, in order so that they can get there too. because it doesn't serve me any purpose to get to 140 unless I'm taking friends of mine along with me, you know, and and just having that mindset and taking accountability for, my life, my thoughts, my actions, and my deeds, and that. But for right now, I'm on vacation, so there will be another episode.
Yes, that's awesome. So it sounds like going bigger for you means breaking the expectations that people have for what aging looks like, for what health looks like, and understanding how old you are in your cells and your maturity, all of that, and breaking that yourself, but also taking people with you so that
Mhm.
everyone begins to ascend past that expectation of this is what age means, this is what getting older means, this is what ends.
Well, that too, and also, something that when I first got up here, I went into New York City. I haven't been in New York City in like 15 years, and 10 years maybe, and 15 might be exaggerated. But when I got there, because the bus from Cornell takes you from Cornell up here where there's more cows than there are people, down to New York City where there's a lot of people. It's the absolute opposite. And when I first got there, I just went like, wow. But it isn't I don't like New York necessarily. I can do it for 5 days, then I gotta get out of there or less. I just like the energy of New York, because that energy is very elevating. It thinks people think faster and sharper and, and come up with faster, quicker solutions. And everybody that I met when I was there kept on saying to me without me saying to like, oh, you can tell I'm from another planet. I was just joking when I went into some place. The guy goes, he looks at me, he goes, welcome home, and I'm going like, "What?" But I got that the whole weekend that I was there. I went there for a business trip. And the more people said that to me, I kept on thinking, do I have like a sign over my invisible sign over my head? Because it was just said, I said to her, I haven't been here in a while. And she said, well, welcome home. When's the last time you were here? She said, like you have such positive energy. So I'm not, I know that being in some place like New York can totally wear you down, but I like the idea of being someplace where there's a lot more people. And that will be for certain, is that I have to have the accessibility to see more people than cows and silos. And so, on that note, that's where that piece goes. And it's more than just about looking good. My grandmother was 98 when she passed away, and at 94, she had no lines on her face. Someone goes, oh, it's genetics. I said, yes, but I read labels. I want to know what I'm ingesting because you are not what you have the ability to eat. You have what you have the ability to absorb. So if you eat foods that ruin your gut, then don't expect you're absorbing things at the wrong rate or in the wrong place, where you should have enzymes being absorbed or a cofactor for a vitamin. You're absorbing it too soon and your is stressing the body out. You got to make sure you fix your gut, you change your life. But that's a good basis to go from, is that. And then it shows like your skin to your face, your skin always, it doesn't lie.
So where can people go? I know you've been at this and you have several books out. We talked about 4 different books that either you wrote or are featured in. You've been on, I think you said 250 podcasts. If people want to learn more from Dr. Pat, where do they go and where would you direct them first?
I would first direct them, if they're on LinkedIn, I'd first direct them LinkedIn to my profile. And I'm sure you have in the show notes that will be there. My website, which is going to be under construction very quickly and in the near future, but the basic information is there. Um, there's also, I talk to people. I have 2, um, science-based assessments that I give out. One is to find out how well you're handling toxins in your environment, because toxins and your ability to get rid of them is huge. We didn't even talk about that. That's a whole nother podcast. Um, but I have, the
I'll have to have
people
you
can.
back on to describe that.
Well, then we have that, and I have another, it's the first chapter of my book, Why Are You Sick, Fat, and Tired? and that tells you the four basic functions of the gut. And you got to have the bottom lines working for you first before you start, going, hey, my microbiome level is, and like, I'm going to introduce microbiomes. Are you introducing the right ones? And like, I could go on. That's a whole other podcast. But how you're handling toxins in your environment is whether or not you're a candidate to do a detoxification, which you do not want to purge your body of anything. You want to, you want to like address, like, how do I improve function of what I already got going on? And then you can sit there and go like, and by doing that, your body will naturally get rid of the things that are not great for you to have in your body. Because that's the idea of the detoxification. Because if you don't have that, then all those toxins get stored in blood, brain, bone, and fat, and that's not a good ending. That's not the way you want the end of your story to be written.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation. We've talked about everything from politics to networking to health to understanding how to optimize your life at every level. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being on here with me. I've gained so much from this conversation. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure completely.